In this video, you're going to get practice filling in the information for the public company comparables, and then I'm going to walk you through what all this data actually means and tell you something about the key operating metrics we look at when analyzing public company comparables. So you see on this page that what I've done here is I have the 5 companies that we'd selected before listed right here: Hewlett-Packard, Dell, Cisco, Intel, and Motorola. And what I've done is I've filled in all the important information for each of them. So everything about their equity value, enterprise value, and then historical and forward revenue, EBITDA, and earnings per share projections right here. In terms of how I actually got the numbers, for Hewlett-Packard, just go to this, we actually walked through this calculation together, and I showed you how to get all this information from their filings and from equity research. And for the other companies on this list, I went through a similar process of going through filings, then looking up the projected numbers in equity research. I'm not going to show you all that here or go into all those details because you don't need to know that for interviews. I just wanted to give you that one example with Hewlett-Packard. For the actual information that's displayed here, the key things are that you need to have equity value somewhere and then enterprise value, especially if we're working with companies in this industry, in the technology industry. So you definitely need to have those, and you need to have everything in between to get from equity value to enterprise value. So cash, debt, preferred stock, minority interest, other liabilities. We went through many of those items before, so I'm not going to repeat everything here. Normally though, when you present this, you actually hide this, and you can group it together in Excel and hide it as I've done right here. That's because we really want to stay focused on just the equity value and enterprise value in this case. Now, in terms of the actual metrics you look at, you definitely want to include revenue, and then beyond revenue, you want to have something that indicates the profitability of the company. In this case, I've selected EBITDA as well as earnings per share. Now, depending on what industry you're in, you may have something different here. So for retail and airlines, for example, we might be using EBITDAR. If we're working with banks or financial institutions, for example, well, maybe we would not use revenue at all, and instead we would just have earnings per share and then book value per share. So it really depends on what industry you're working in, but you almost always want to have some kind of profitability metric, whether it's EBITDA, EBITDAR, EPS, and so on. And in most companies, you also want to have revenue displayed on this page as well. In terms of what data to select here, so how far back do we go historically? Do we go 1 year back, 2 years, 3 years, and then how far forward do we go? Most of the time you want to have at least one historical year and one future year, as we do right here. Sometimes you will go back 2 years or 3 years, sometimes you'll go forward 2 years or 3 years. I would say to go beyond 2 or 3 years is very odd for public company comparables. Usually you keep it to one historical year, maybe 2, and then maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 projected years. Another metric we like to display over here is revenue growth. The reason we do this is because when we look at revenue multiples, valuation multiples for these companies, a revenue multiple means something much different if a company is growing at, say, 21.8% versus if it's shrinking at 6%, negative 6%, or if it's growing at only 7.7%. So we want to display revenue growth here because we want to have some context for when we look at revenue valuation multiples later on. The same goes for EBITDA margin. When we're comparing the EBITDA multiples of companies in this example, it doesn't mean that much if, let's say, one company's EBITDA margin is 45%, and then another company's EBITDA margin is 7.5%, and then the multiples are also dramatically different. So we display the margins on here to have a sense of how profitable the companies are, because we expect that companies that are more profitable will actually have lower EBITDA multiples, if you're thinking about the math there. Something with a 45% margin is probably going to have a lower EBITDA multiple than something with only a 7.5% margin. So we like to have that for our reference just to see what kinds of multiples they have and how it compares to their operating performance, their revenue growth and EBITDA margin in this case. One question you might have, if you've really been paying attention, is in terms of the years here. I have 2009 and 2010 listed. But if you recall, back when we looked at Apple, their fiscal year actually ended in September, specifically at the end of September for Apple. So Apple's fiscal year ends in September. So based on that, what am I really referring to here with the years? And generally with public company comparables, the answer here is that you have to normalize the revenue, EBITDA, EPS, and other figures to match the company you're analyzing. So in this case, what we've done is we've normalized all these numbers to match Apple's fiscal year. So for example, if a company's fiscal year ends in December, then what we would do is we would take Q4, Q1, Q2, and Q3 going to the end of September, and we would use that to match up to Apple's fiscal year. Now that's something called calendarization, and we're not going to get into that in detail here, but that is the basic idea behind how it works. Now if it's very close together, so in the HP example, their fiscal year ended in October. In that case, we often leave it alone if it's only a few weeks or a month apart. If it's a quarter apart or more than a quarter, then we have to normalize it and calendarize the numbers to match Apple's fiscal year, which ends in September. Now, another thing that you often do on here, in fact, you almost always do, is actually enter some data about this set of comparables. So we like to look at the maximum and then 75th and 25th percentiles, median, and minimum for many of these numbers. So I'm going to show you how to do that in Excel. For maximum, I'm just going to use the max function, apply it to all these numbers. For 75th percentile, I'm going to enter the quartile function and apply it to all those numbers. Since this is the 75th percentile, I'm going to enter 3 for the quartile function here. For median, I can just use the median function. 25th percentile, once again, I'm going to use the quartile function and enter 1 this time because this is the first quartile, the 25th percentile. And then minimum, I'm going to use the min function right here. So we have all those formulas set up. And what I'm going to do now is just copy these formulas all the way across using the same strategy we've seen before, just highlighting everything with the shift and arrow keys and then pressing Alt ESF. And so that gives us our median equity value, enterprise value, revenue, EBITDA, EPS, and so on. This is useful because later on when we actually go about using these numbers to value Apple, we're going to be concerned mostly with the median here. We don't pay too much attention to the ones on the upper end of the range or the lower end of the range. Normally we like to go in the middle for a set of data like this. You can see that on average the companies have been growing at around 8, 9, 10% with around 15% margins. The median EPS number here is not telling us too much, so that's really what we can gather from this. Now by itself, this data is not too helpful with helping us make predictions about Apple's valuation. The way we normally use this is that we look at these public company comparables and then we actually compare them to what Apple's numbers look like. So if we go down here, I'm going to enter company name. If we went in here and actually entered in Apple's data, then we could get a lot more information about this data set and what it means. And actually for your exercise in this video, in this lesson, I want you to go in and do this. So if you recall back on our 3 statement sheet right here, we had all this information about Apple. What I want you to do is to go back to this sheet and enter in all this information onto the public comps page. Don't hard code it in as I've done here for many of these items. Instead, you want to be linking directly. So hit the equal sign and then control page up to move to the Apple 3 statements page. You pull in the relevant number from right here, press enter, and go back like that. And you go through this process for all the others. Equals and then control page up to move over to the left, control page down to move over to the right. So pause this video right now, give that a shot yourself, and then when you're done, you can unpause this and then I'll go through it with you. Okay, good. So here's how we get this information for Apple. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just expand this temporarily. I'm going to start with diluted shares, which I will pull in from right over here. Equity value, I'm actually going to make this a formula. We could actually just pull it in as well. In this case, I'm just going to copy this down and paste formula. For the rest of these numbers, for cash, debt, and the rest, I'm going to go over here and just pull them all from right here. To do this, I'm just pressing equals and then control page up to move over. Preferred stock, minority interest, and then other liabilities. For Apple, these are mostly zero, so it doesn't even matter that much. For the enterprise value formula, we could just copy it from the first page. Here, once again, I'm just going to copy the formula and paste it with Alt-ESF. Now for the revenue, EBITDA, and EPS, we're going to go back using control page up. I'm going to go down to the income statement, and I'm pulling in the 2009 numbers right here. So let's go down and find EBITDA. And then EPS, control page up to move over to the three-statement model. I will pull in the EPS as well. Now one trick I can do here is rather than linking in everything twice for the 2010 numbers, I can actually just say control C, Alt ESF to paste the formula. And you can see that we're pulling in the 2010 numbers now. For the percentages and margins, I'm just going to copy these, control C, and then Alt ESF to paste them. So there we have Apple's own numbers. So based on these numbers now, what does this data set really tell us? So let me just close these expanded areas once again by clicking on them. So looking at some of Apple's operating metrics here, especially the growth rate for revenue and the EBITDA margin, they are definitely among the best companies listed here. They are fairly close to the maximum, which in this case would actually be Intel. They have the maximum revenue growth and the maximum EBITDA margin. Based on this data, I would expect Apple's valuation multiples to be very similar to Intel's because they have a very similar operational profile. Relatively the same revenue growth, relatively similar EBITDA margins. Intel actually has higher margins than Apple here. So based on this, I would expect their multiples to be closest to Intel's. Since they are performing well above the median of the set, we would definitely expect their revenue, EBITDA, and PE multiples to all be well above the median for the valuation multiples of this set as well. So that's what this data is really telling us. Normally you can infer what a company's revenue multiple will be like based on its growth, and then its EBITDA margin and other profitability metrics will determine what multiples like EBITDA and EBITDAR and anything else based on profitability will look like. So that's what this data set is telling us. So now you should have a better understanding of how you actually display public company comparables, how you pull in the information from elsewhere, in this case from our operating model right over here, and then how you actually display everything on a page, show the company you're analyzing as well, and then figure out what these operating metrics are really telling you, how to select the appropriate ones, and what kind of valuation multiples you might get for your companies based on what the metrics here look like. Coming up in the next video, we're going to complete the second part of this analysis, which is to look at the valuation multiples. So to actually take all this operational information and then use it to calculate the appropriate valuation multiples for each of these companies, figure out the median of the set, and then see how Apple compares valuation-wise.